I'm sure you know I'm a certified geek. And I've been a geek for most of my life. So let me tell you how I got into geekdom. It all started more than 50 years ago. I was in high school in 1956, and I think it was one of the most important years of my life because two things happened. One was I built my first high voltage generator. And the second event was I met my sweetheart, who became my wife. And just to show you about my ability to stay committed to a concept, we're still married, but I'm about to change my life path. Not because of her, but I'm going to change from geekdom to a commitment to working on wicked problems. Now let me first define wicked problems, which is this term of art in system engineering. Wicked problems have no closed form solution. Wicked problems change when you work on the problem. And when you work on wicked problems, because the rules keep changing, you go through alternate periods of euphoria and depression. You feel kind of bipolar when you're working on wicked problems. But as it turns out in my career, I found out most of the important problems in the world are wicked. Now, wicked is not evil. I should have known that when I gave a talk at a Catholic school, and I noticed all my talk about wicked problems, I was getting deeper and deeper, and I had to explain to the priests that it's not about evil. Wicked problems are the opposite of tame problems. Here in town, in Albuquerque, it took us 30 years to get permission to build a small bridge across the Rio Grande. Getting permission was wicked. Building the bridge only took 2 years. That was tame. So I worked my entire career on tame problems without knowing they were tame, because a tame problem can be decomposed into its component parts. You can solve the parts, you can get the answers, and then you can put it all back together again. A wicked problem can't be solved that way. When you work on a wicked problem, you work on all the parts all of the time. Now, the particular area where I have become increasingly interested in the application of wicked engineering is something I call neuro system engineering, a combination of neuroscience and system engineering to solve real problems having to do with the brain. Wow. There could be nothing more wicked than that. So an example of a wicked problem having to do with the brain is stress. One of the most prevalent injuries that we see from the soldiers coming back from Afghanistan or from Iraq are stress disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorders turn out to be about 20%, characteristic of 20% of all the soldiers coming back. And this is becoming the signature disease of insurgency warfare. Now, the reason why there's very high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder leading to depression and stunningly vast increases in suicides is pretty understood. It's truly a wicked problem. So one of the wicked problems in neuroscience engineering that I decided to focus on is stress. And it's not just about soldiers. I venture to say that some of you all look pretty calm, but do any of you have any stress problems? Show of hands. It's conceivable. Why is that? Increasingly, because modern life is filled with so much confusion, ambiguity, uncertainty, rapid changes, unexpected events happening, that leads to stress. So what do you do about stress problems? Well, the first thing you look at are the component parts, and you try to deal with all the component parts at the same time. It has to do with genetic predisposition. It has to do with context. It has to do with relationships, personality, and it even has to do with how your brain is wired. And if you're really going to do the neurosystem engineering of stress, you have to bring together the genetic experts, the behavioral scientists, the engineers, the physicists, to finally make some kind of an advance. Now, an example of a genetic effect on stress is genetic predisposition. to be sensitive to stress. As you probably know, some people are cool as a cucumber, and some people are scared out of their wits half the time. And a lot of that's genetic, but there's also what happened to them in their early life. So trying to understand the genetic predisposition is an area of advance in science and technology today. But then once you have that, you can begin to bring together some understanding of these contextual issues involving personality, and then finally you get to brain wiring. Now here's where the engineer and the physicist start to really play a role. Let me talk about how you know what's going on in the brain. Well, the idea of the neurosystem engineer is to look under the hood. Not just look at the outside of the engine, but look under the hood, and this is an engine analogy, and see what is the compression ratio of the cylinders. Thank you. Try to understand the firing rate of the spark plugs, the performance, the compression, and how that relates to torque. That's what an engineer would do. Well, how do you do that with the brain? Well, first of all, the brain's only about 3 pounds. It runs at about 20 watts. One of those dim bulbs is about the same power as your brain. But if you look at it carefully, you find out that the brain consists of about 100 billion neurons. And every neuron has thousands or tens of thousands of connections. And the whole thing runs at about 10 hertz. Well, you put all that together, and you have probably one of the most complex gadgets in the universe. So how can you possibly understand what's going on? Well, there are 3 things we can measure. With a gadget called an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imager, we can measure what part of the brain gets more oxygen than another part of the brain when it's doing something. Another thing we can do is we can measure very weak magnetic fields. What part of the brain is sending currents to what other parts of the brain, and we do that by measuring the magnetic fields. Or we can put little electrodes all over your head and measure electric fields. Now those 3 gadgets, the fMRI, MEG, and the EG, gives you a very complex picture of what is going on, where it's functioning, what is happening, what these 2 parts are doing, how the connection works. Is it top-down, or is it bottom-up? Is it left versus right? And what happens when you begin to think and solve complex problems? It all swirls around in a very complex manner. So trying to understand issues of genetic predisposition, context, trying to put that together with understanding of the wiring is a very complex problem. And you might say it's an impossible problem. But here's where computers come in. We can build very complex models on today's giant computers, and we can begin to assemble that information. So that's the major advance in neurosystem engineering, is computer simulation. By the way, the most powerful computer in the world runs at 2 petaflops per second. 2 times 10 to the 15th. That's 2,000 trillion operations per second. We all know what a trillion now is, because that's what the healthcare bill is going to cost. So it's 1,000 in dollars, 1,000 of those 1,000 trillion operations per second. So one advance is being able to use giant computers. The second big advance, I think, will be in the area of neural implants. Microsensors can be made extremely tiny, that can be externally powered, that can measure the electrical signals in your brain. I'm not talking about a deep implant. You can put this actually on your external skin, but more than likely these electrical diagnostic tools will be implanted, will be worn, externally powered, no wires. And when you want to know what's going on at the end of the day, you take out your little computer, read it out, and provide that information to a central computer that will tell you what your brain is doing and when it's doing it. So neural implants can, I envision, will be quite commonplace. You say you're crazy. Well, back in the 50s, somebody suggested that a cardiac pacemaker be implanted in a human for the first time. And that cardiac pacemaker kept that particular first patient alive for over 40 years. So I think that this notion of a neural implant pacemaker of the kind that understand what your brain is doing will be another major advance. So first is the computer simulation. Secondly, neural implants, neural prostheses. And the third, I think, major advance will be in electrical stimulation. Now you're probably shocked, no pun intended, because you're thinking I'm talking about some kind of electric convulsive therapy. Well, I'm not. I'm talking about applying very weak electric and changing magnetic fields to specific parts of your brain that you've identified using these diagnostic techniques and these modeling and simulation tools that will deal with problems. What kind of problem did I first mention? Stress. So we know that stress is counteracted by a contextual environment of trust. You say, well, what's the science in that? Well, stress is largely dominated by chemicals, stress chemicals, but they're counteracted by trust chemicals. And I think the moderating influence between trust and stress is sleep. And I think sleep can be modified electrically, very mild electric currents, to produce a high-quality restorative sleep. So that's a future direction for research. But where else might we go with this neurosystem engineering? Well, as you can imagine, as our population gets older, and people live to be in their 70s and 80s and 90s, what we're finding out is modern medicine is becoming more and more effective in preserving physical health. But it's made absolutely no advances in preserving mental acuity. And in fact, if you live to be 85 and you're perfectly healthy, the chances are 1 in 2 that you won't remember the name of the person sitting next to you. Mental acuity declines rapidly past the age of 85. There's been practically no advance in that area. So I mentioned earlier to you that I've been married quite a long time. And one thing I've noticed over this period of almost 50 years is that whenever I ask my wife, where are the car keys? She always says the same thing. Where did you put them? So one of the major advances I can foresee in neurosystem engineering, instead of asking my wife that same standard question, I'll just flip a switch and I'll remember. Thank you.